My father prioritized my cousin over me, investing in his education and future while leaving me to struggle alone. His decisions shattered my dreams and left me feeling abandoned, but I refused to let his betrayal define me. Through sheer determination. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but here I am. I'm 28 years old and have faced more than my fair share of hardship, especially with family. My mother died giving birth to me, and that loss seems to have set the tone for my relationship with my dad. He never recovered from her death and always acted as if I were to blame. I have no memories of her, though relatives told me how overjoyed she was when I was born. She had long dreamed of being a mother and struggled with infertility for years before finally conceiving me. Knowing this only makes the loss even more heartbreaking. Growing up, our home was filled with photos of my mother. My dad kept all her things just as she had left them, as if our house were a shrine to her memory. Her clothes still hung in the closet and her books remained on the shelves. It often felt like I was living with the ghost of a woman I'd never truly know. Sometimes I'd sneak into her room just to touch her belongings, desperate for a connection with the mother I never met. My relationship with my dad was entirely different. He was there physically, but emotionally he was miles away. He went through the motions of parenting, making sure I was fed, clothed, and got to school on time, but there was never any warmth or affection. No hugs, no kind words, not even a simple pat on the back when I did well. I always felt like an outsider in my own home. Most days, he barely even looked at me, and when he did, it was usually to criticize or compare me to my cousin Jake. Jake's father, my uncle, died in a car accident when Jake was 7, and my dad took him under his wing. I still remember the day we got the news about my uncle's death. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when the phone rang. My dad answered, and I watched his face crumble as he listened. That was the only time I ever saw him cry. After the call, he slumped into a chair and stared off into space for what felt like hours. After that, Jake started spending a lot more time at our house. At first, I was excited, thinking another kid might make things more fun and even help my dad open up. But it didn't take long to realize that Jake's presence only made my relationship with my dad worse. He would often say things like, "Why can't you be more like Jake?" or "Jake would never do that." It felt as if Jake was the son he always wanted, while I was just there. Jake was athletic, outgoing, and charming, everything I wasn't. He was the life of the party while I was shy and preferred reading. I worked hard to make my dad proud. I tried to learn about his interests, got good grades, and even joined every sports team. Yet no matter how much effort I put in, it never seemed to be enough. My dad would praise Jake for the smallest achievements, but I never received any credit for mine. I remember a science fair when I was about 12. I built a complicated, moving model of the solar system that I'd worked on for weeks, and I was excited to show it to my dad, hoping it would finally make him proud. But when I got home and told him about it, he just nodded and went back to chatting with Jake about a football game. It felt like I wasn't even there. As we got older, the comparisons only grew starker. People made fun of us for being in the same grade, even though I did better in high school. My dad always found ways to downplay my accomplishments, insisting that Jake's needs were more important. I recall one parent-teacher meeting when my English teacher praised an essay I'd written. She told my dad it was one of the best papers she'd ever seen from someone my age and that I had real talent as a writer. Instead, my dad grunted and asked if that would help me secure a big sports grant. The teacher looked confused, and I was mortified. Despite everything, a part of me still longed for change. I believed that if I could find the right thing, some magic key to unlock my dad's affection, everything might be okay. I chased that impossible dream throughout my childhood and teenage years. When it came time for college, I pushed myself hard and enrolled at a decent university, determined to launch my future. I knew money would be tight, but I assumed my dad would at least help a little. Boy, was I mistaken. I'll never forget the day I overheard my dad on the phone with Jake. He was telling Jake that he'd pay for his entire college tuition. My heart sank. When I asked if he could help me too, my dad looked at me like I was crazy. "Jake needs it more than I can pay for both of you," he said. That was the moment my college dreams shattered. I tried to make things work by juggling classes, a part-time job at a local diner, and countless scholarship applications, but it wasn't enough. The pressure became unbearable. I was working evenings and weekends, trying to cover expenses while still finding time to study and sleep. After the first semester, I had no choice but to drop out. I simply couldn't afford it. The few part-time jobs I could find barely covered tuition, while Jake was living it up at a renowned university, completely funded by my dad. Every time he posted pictures of his sleek dorm, spring break trips, or the new laptop he bought him, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That was the breaking point for me. I packed my things and left home, cutting off all contact with my dad and Jake. It hurt deeply, but I knew I had to escape that toxic environment. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my late mother and the cousin who somehow replaced me in my father's heart. The past few years have been incredibly tough. I took any job I could find, waiting tables, working in construction, pulling night shifts at gas stations, just to keep a roof over my head and food on the table. It was hard enough already, especially when I saw Jake's social media updates about his amazing college experiences and the great job he landed after graduation. Despite everything, I'm slowly building a life on my own terms. Now I have a decent job, nothing fancy, but it pays the bills. I manage a local bookstore, which isn't my dream career, but being surrounded by books gives me comfort. I'm also taking night classes at community college, working toward the degree I've always wanted. It's not an easy journey, but at least I'm making progress on my own. Along the way, I've found some great friends, people who accept me for who I am rather than who they want me to be. They've become the family I never really had. We have weekly game nights, go camping when we can, and support each other through thick and thin. It's far from perfect, but it's mine, and that makes all the difference. I thought I had left all that family drama behind, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. Just yesterday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I was shocked to hear my dad's voice after 3 long years of silence. He was calling for help. I wasn't sure how to feel, but one thing was clear, I wasn't that kid desperate for his approval anymore. It's been a week since that call, and I'm still trying to process it all. Talking with him brought back a flood of memories, mostly painful ones. His voice sounded older, more worn out, and desperate. He started with awkward small talk, asking how I was doing, as if nothing had happened in the last few years. Then he got to the point, he needed money, a lot of it. I was stunned. This was the man who never helped me pay for college and always put my cousin first, and now he was asking me for financial support. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I finally found my voice, I asked why he was coming to me. What about Jake, his golden boy? Wasn't he supposed to help out? My dad fell silent for a moment before mumbling that Jake was busy with his new job and couldn't help right now. I couldn't help but laugh. After years of hearing how much better Jake was, now I was expected to step up. I made it clear exactly what I thought. I suggested he talk to Jake instead. After all, he'd always been the favorite. There was a long silence on the line, and then my dad started talking about regretting past choices and wanting to make things right. I cut him off, telling him it was too little, too late. I'd spent years trying to earn his love and approval, and now that he needed something, he was suddenly remorseful. I ended the call. Right after hanging up, a mix of emotions hit me. Part of me felt guilty for turning him away because he was still my father, but a bigger part felt relieved. For the first time, I had stood up for myself and refused to fall back into that need for approval. The next few days were rough. I kept replaying our conversation, wondering if I had done the right thing. I thought about all the times I needed him, not just for college tuition, but for the small moments when a kid needs a father, showing up at school events, giving advice about girls, even helping with learning to drive. I remembered my first heartbreak at 16 when Sarah, the girl I thought was the one, broke up with me for a football player. I came home in tears, eyes red from crying, and my dad, sitting on the couch watching TV, barely looked up. I hoped he'd ask what was wrong, but he just grunted, telling me I was blocking the screen. I went to my room and cried myself to sleep that night. Then there was the time I got my driver's license. Most of my friends had their dads teach them to drive, but not me. I had to beg my neighbor, Mr. Johnson, to help. When I finally passed the test, I was so excited to share the news. I ran home only to find my dad in the garage working on his car with Jake. I showed off my new license, Jake congratulated me, but my dad just nodded and went back to explaining something about the engine. I never really got the chance to drive his car. All of this made me wonder what kind of trouble he was in to need my money now. My dad had always been so proud, almost too proud. For him to reach out like this, something had to be serious. Even so, I still worried a little about him. But then I remembered all the times I worried about my own future because I wasn't making enough money after quitting college. He never cared about that, so why should I care about him now? I built my life on my own after moving out to start over. I relocated to a new town where no one recognized me. I took whatever job I could find and managed to rent a tiny studio I could barely afford. By day, I cleaned up, and by night, I worked as a bartender. I was constantly exhausted, yet I pushed through on my own. Some evenings after my bar shift, my feet hurt and reeked of smoke and beer, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the wrong choice. I could have swallowed my pride, stayed home, and tried to work things out with my dad, but I remembered all the judgment and never feeling good enough, and I knew I'd chosen the right path. Over time, I began to feel more confident about my decision. I realized that by refusing to give in to his demands, I was finally taking control. I wasn't that kid he used to disregard and push around. Now that I'm an adult, I make my own choices and owe him nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity about what exactly led to this situation. What happened that made Jake, the so-called perfect child, unable or unwilling to help? There were moments when I wanted to learn more about what was going on with my dad and my cousin, but I hesitated. Did I really want to open that can of worms and stir up old pain and resentment? I even thought about reaching out to my aunt, Jake's mom, even though she could be distant at times. She had always been kind to me, and maybe she'd understand what was happening. The last time I saw her was at a family gathering right before my shift. She hugged Jake tightly, praising him for getting into a great college, but gave me only a weak smile and a brief pat on the shoulder. That was enough for me to decide not to call her. I'm still unsure about what to do next. Even as I write this, part of me wants to leave the past behind and focus on my own growth, while another part can't stop wondering about the real story between my dad and Jake. Only time will tell if I dive deeper into it. It's been about a month since my last update, and a lot has unfolded. Despite my initial reluctance, my curiosity got the better of me, so I began investigating why my dad suddenly needed help and why Jake wasn't stepping up. I reached out to a few family friends who still kept in touch with my dad. At first, they were hesitant to reveal too much, but eventually I pieced together a pretty clear picture of what was going on. I started with Mrs. Peterson, who had been my mom's best friend and had always treated me kindly growing up. She was surprised to hear from me but was happy to chat. After some small talk, I steered the conversation toward my dad and Jake. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then sighed deeply before explaining everything. Apparently, my dad had gone all in on supporting Jake, far beyond just paying for college. He had helped Jake with a down payment on a house, bought him a car, and even invested in a business venture Jake wanted to start. To do all this, my dad had taken out loans and maxed out his credit cards, drowning in debt just to give Jake the life he thought he deserved. Mrs. Peterson recalled a conversation from a few years back when my dad was bragging about Jake's future as a big-shot businessman. When she asked about me, he simply shrugged and said he hoped I was doing okay. The indifference in his tone shocked her. Next, I contacted my old neighbor, Mr. Johnson, the same man who taught me how to drive. Always observant, he filled me in on some recent developments. Apparently, Jake had convinced my dad to invest in a tech startup he was launching with a few college friends. While Mr. Johnson wasn't clear on all the details, he mentioned that my dad had even remortgaged the house to fund the venture. The twist was that Jake's new job, the one my dad had boasted about, wasn't going well at all. The business had flopped, and now Jake was struggling to make ends meet. When my dad turned to him for help with the mounting debt, Jake apparently told him he couldn't spare anything right now. Mr. Johnson even overheard an argument between them just a few weeks ago. Jake arrived in a flashy new car, and when my dad confronted him about the failed business and lost money, Jake snapped that it wasn't his fault, blaming a changing market, and promised to pay back when he could before speeding off, leaving my dad looking utterly defeated. I have to admit, a small part of me felt a twisted relief after years of being compared to Jake and constantly hearing that I wasn't good enough. It turns out the so-called golden child wasn't so golden after all. My dad had invested all his hopes and resources in Jake, and now those dreams were crumbling. Mostly, though, I just felt drained, tired of the endless drama, lingering pain, and constant what-ifs. I couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if my dad had invested in me the way he did in Jake. Maybe I'd have graduated college and ended up in a completely different career. But perhaps I wouldn't have learned the priceless lessons about independence and determination that I did. I still remember the hard days after dropping out, juggling several jobs and barely getting by on ramen noodles and cheap coffee. I recall the long nights of studying after grueling shifts, pushed only by my drive to improve, even without a formal education. It was a tough road, but it made me who I am today. I debated whether to share what I'd learned with my dad. In the end, I decided to text him. I told him I knew what was going on with Jake and the bill, not offering help, nor bragging, but simply hoping he'd realize his choices affected us both. After a few hours, he replied with a long message. He apologized, admitting that he'd been unfair, and explained that his grief over losing my mom had clouded his judgment. He mentioned how proud my mom would have been of the man I'd become, despite his shortcomings as a dad, and he asked if we could meet to talk. I spent a long time thinking about his message. A part of me, still that little kid craving a father's love, wanted to say yes. I even imagined us sitting down and magically fixing everything. But as someone who's had to work hard for everything, I knew better. I reflected on all the milestones he missed, my high school graduation, when I scanned the crowd for his face only to be hit with disappointment, or my first apartment, furnished with second-hand finds and determination, and even the recent promotion at the bookstore, a moment I celebrated with friends. In the end, I responded by letting him know I wasn't ready to meet. While I acknowledged his apology, I made it clear that words couldn't erase years of neglect and favoritism. I expressed my need for time and space, insisting he respect that boundary. I also made it obvious I wouldn't bail him out financially. His choices got him here, just as mine brought me to where I am today. It wasn't my job to fix his mistakes. As I write this update, I feel a sense of relief, not exactly happiness, but as if a heavy weight has finally lifted. For so long, I struggled to earn my father's love, always wondering what was wrong with me that made him favor Jake. Now I see it wasn't about me at all, it was about his own unresolved pain and inability to deal with loss. I'm not sure what the future holds for my relationship with him, or if there will be one at all. Maybe someday we'll have a genuine conversation about everything that's happened. But for now, I'm focused on my own growth. I'm continuing my night classes, working hard toward my degree, and building bonds with people who value me for who I truly am. Just last week, I helped my friend Sarah, yes, that Sarah from high school, move into her new apartment. As we unpacked boxes and set up furniture, it hit me that these real connections, this chosen family, means so much more than the approval of someone who never recognized my worth. Life isn't always easy, but I'm forging my own path, and for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I'm ready to face it on my own terms, armed with the strength I've built from years of self-reliance, a strength no father's favoritism can ever take away. Months passed, and I continued to focus on building my own life, attending night classes, working toward my degree, and nurturing friendships that truly mattered. Then one day, my phone rang with a message from my dad. This time, his tone was softer, more vulnerable. He admitted that he'd started therapy and was beginning to understand his own pain. After some thought, I agreed to meet him at a quiet park, somewhere neutral and calm. Sitting on a weathered bench beneath the cool shade of autumn trees, we talked, really talked, for the first time in years. He opened up about his regrets and the deep sorrow he'd carried since losing my mom, while I shared the struggles of growing up feeling unloved and overlooked. I explained how I had turned that pain into a drive for self-improvement, but also how the years of neglect left scars that weren't easily healed. In that honest conversation, I realized forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about freeing yourself from its grip. We both acknowledged that while the past couldn't be undone, we could try to move forward with clearer boundaries and more honest communication. I made it clear that I wasn't looking for financial support or a perfect reunion, just a genuine effort to understand each other and build something respectful, however fragile it might be. He listened and promised to work on his part, accepting that our relationship needed time and effort from both sides. Walking away from that meeting, I felt a quiet relief settle in. The heavy burden of years of resentment was slowly lifting. In the weeks that followed, our connection grew through small gestures, a brief phone call, a shared lunch, an occasional text checking in. While our bond would always bear the marks of our past, it was finally evolving into something more honest and real. Ultimately, my journey wasn't about winning my father's approval. It was about recognizing my own worth, healing old wounds, and learning to live on my own terms. As I continue to pursue my dreams and build relationships with people who appreciate me for who I am, I carry with me the lesson that every challenge shapes us into stronger individuals. The past remains a part of me, but now I face the future with resilience, forgiveness, and a renewed sense of peace. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do and hit the notification bell for more eye-opening real-life stories.